Hi, this is Melissa Turner with bmagazine.org, and I'm joined by Katharina Rall with Human Rights Watch. She is the Senior Research Fellow for Human Rights and Environment, which comes at the cross-section of UN COP27 and some of the issues that have been coming out in the media over the last few weeks. And Katharina, tell us just a little bit about what you do at Human Rights Watch.
Thank you, Melissa. Thanks for inviting me. So in my work, I focus really on the intersection of climate and human rights. So I'm looking at how the climate crisis is impacting human rights across the world, but I'm also looking at how restrictions and violations of human rights make it harder for activists in particular to prevent the climate crisis. Yeah. And so one of the issues I'm currently looking at is the situation in Egypt and the lead up to COP27 and how things are unfolding.
Yes. We spoke with Amnesty International a couple weeks ago, and we were talking about the concerns surrounding Egypt being chosen for COP27 this year. Tell us just a little bit more about that. Why are we so concerned as a human rights community and as activists looking at COP27 being held in Egypt this year?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I would say there are mainly three concerns. The first one is really about participation at COP and how observers and civil society in general, climate activists, indigenous peoples, how they are going to be able to participate and voice their concerns, both at the official COP venue, but also outside at protests on the streets. So that's one big concern. And we've heard, concerns particularly around protests, but also about delays, for example, in processing visas, even getting access. So that's currently a huge discussion among many of the activists wanting to attend. The second problem that we see is really the attempt of the Egyptian government to use its role as the COP27 presidency to promote an image of openness and tolerance, when really political oppression under the current President al-Sisi's government has caused one of the country's worst human rights crises in decades. Yeah. And then there's a third issue, and that's connected to what I just mentioned, which is that a lot of the groups and activists, especially in country, but also some of them who left the country, and even other activists wanting to attend COP, they're very concerned about reprisals. So most of them think that maybe while COP is ongoing, they're relatively safe, but they don't know what's going to happen after, once all the international delegations have left the country. And so that's obviously a huge concern and something to monitor well beyond COP in November.
Yes, absolutely. So tell us a little bit more about the statements that Human Rights Watch has made over the summer and then just recently, and what some of the feedback and response you've gotten so far is.
Sure, yeah. So we've started working on this obviously as soon as Egypt as the COP presidency was announced. And one of the things that we did was to specifically look at how environmental groups in Egypt have been doing over the past few years. So not just now in the lead up to COP, but really basically since 2014, when the current government took power, kind of how their situation has developed over time. And so what we found in our research is really concerning, in that a lot of the restrictions that civil society generally in Egypt is experiencing is also impacting environmental activism. And in particular, we're concerned about restrictions in terms of research permits. So it's very difficult for groups to get permits, and a lot of them the people we interviewed told us that they basically have given up because the process is just too difficult, so they can't engage in doing research. That's particularly important if you think about environmental monitoring, for example, the fact that
Right.
they're not able to kind of double check and verify whatever information is published. So that's one concern. There's a concern around registration. Again, a well-known issue in Egypt. Registration of NGOs in general is very difficult, and that is impacting environmental groups with a lot of other then concerns in relation to that, including also registration for COP27. And the third big issue, and again, that's not new, is around funding. The difficulties of environmental groups of receiving funding to do their work. As soon as the funding is international, from foreign, whether it's foreign governments, foreign foundations, foreign NGOs, that's a very difficult situation for them, not permitted. And as a result, they're just struggling to build capacity and to do the work they need to do. And one thing we've heard that's specific there to environmental groups is that there's not a very strong funding community for environmental work in Egypt. So they really depend on international funding. So it makes it even harder for them. And it's maybe also a little bit less known that they're impacted by this.
Sure.
So, I mean, these were just some examples, but these three key areas are issues that we found in our research are, extremely concerning.
Yeah.
I mean, it goes beyond these initial three elements that I mentioned. It really creates an environment where activists and NGOs don't feel they can develop the work they need to develop, but they feel there's a lot of pressure and restrictions from the government to begin with. And that's often, of course, linked to fear if they're following what else is happening in the country for human rights defenders across the board.
Right.
So after the release of our report, because you asked about also reactions, we did receive some form of reaction from the Egyptian government, though it's important to emphasize here that they actually did not respond to the research and the elements that I just described to you, but they only commented on one particular issue that we also mentioned in our research, which is around registration for COP and the possibilities of Egyptian groups to register for COP, which according to our knowledge was something that was done in a process that was not open and transparent to all the groups who may have wanted to participate and may have wanted to get registration at an ad hoc basis for this year's COP. So we're concerned about that too, but it's just, it's part of a bigger picture here, which is that the basic elements that are needed for a successful climate summit are not there. And these are around transparency and openness and participation.
Yes. Well, thank you to you and Human Rights Watch and the whole team there for bringing this to light. It's interesting to watch it unfold because perhaps for the first time since the military coup, the world's eyes are on Egypt now. And it's interesting to see how they're reacting and how the world is responding. And it's an interesting opportunity for human rights in Egypt. Tell us a little bit more about what general citizens, other activists, NGOs, other people around the world, what can they do to help raise awareness about the human rights case in Egypt and the great work that you were doing there at Human Rights Watch?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think at a very basic level, it's important to recognize that the climate crisis is a human rights crisis. And that's true, now we're talking about the COP and the situation in Egypt, but that's true globally. So we shouldn't separate those things, but rather think about them jointly and think about how we can put pressure on governments to increase the climate ambition. And then also make sure that governments like Egypt, in this case, the host of the next COP, that they protect rights and create the space for climate activism to happen and for this kind of global pressure to mount. But we can't just say, well, now we're only looking at the human rights situation in Egypt, or we're only looking at what governments should do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But it really needs both, and it needs this kind of global activism to increase the pressure to also well, address the climate crisis, or at least do whatever we can to prevent the worst from happening.
Right.
In terms of actions, there's a lot of there are a lot of online petitions right now. There are other ways how people can, even if they're not attending COP in person, they can follow. There are a lot of online events. There are a lot of groups, especially those working on the Egyptian human rights situation,
Yes.
working on specific cases now. So I think there's a lot out there at the moment. I would definitely encourage people to follow our work and other organizations' work on Twitter, on social media, and to amplify the research and to amplify the campaigns that are ongoing at the moment, because I do think it's a moment when the Egyptian governments and government, and really all governments looking at the COP27, they're susceptible also to that type of pressure, because they want the COP to be a successful summit. They
Right.
want it to look good, but also, you know, achieve some meaningful results for the climate. So it is the right moment, I think, to increase the pressure and amplify all this work that's been done already.
Yes, absolutely. All right. Thank you so much, Katharina, for joining us today, and keep up the great work there at Human Rights Watch.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.